What I intend to do, I'm going to provide an outline of the Australian economy, our seaborne trade, who our trading partners are, just to provide some context for the three speakers that will follow. Now, often forgotten is the fact that Australia actually started as separate colonies. We only federated in 1901. But for those colonies, their economies were based on the provision of raw materials back to the United Kingdom as part of the British Empire, and then from certainly the United Kingdom, the manufactured goods would come back to Australia. Notwithstanding our federation in 1901, notwithstanding the fact that we're 2012 now, our economy is still pretty much shaped that way. We slowly developed a manufacturing base behind high tariffs. Very slowly, we've dismantled that from the 1970s onwards, and for the Australian members of the audience, the ramifications you see in the car industry now actually come from the dismantling of those tariffs, certainly for the car industry. The basis of our economy has always been to export or sell natural resources. Originally it was mainly agricultural, now it's mainly minerals, in order to actually import or buy those goods we cannot or do not wish to make. Cannot might be a technical issue, will not might be why should we can get it from somewhere else. And this is the economic theory of comparative advantage. What have you got? How should you spend your money? How should you do things? Why should you do something if you can get it cheap from somebody else? Now, if you look at the direction of our trade, I mean, the British Empire remained our major trading partner until the 1960s. Now, in the mid-1950s, we signed a commerce agreement with Japan. This is as we sort of sorted out the resolution of World War II. During the 1960s, the United Kingdom was actually trying to enter the European Economic Community, and they entered that on 1 January 1973. The day they entered that, all preferential trading agreements with Australia ceased. So we'd gone from a very long time of being closely linked into the British Empire, then the United Kingdom, special deals. 1973, all that changed. That's when we took the greater focus into Asia, which had started back in the mid-50s. Now, as I said, from the mid-70s, we started the difficult process of dismantling the protection to our industry to become economically competitive. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. Now, there's always a lag in trade data, but if you look at 2009, 2010, you can say that the Australian economy is valued at about $1.3 trillion. Our seaborne imports are about $157 billion, and exports $179 billion. So trade is very, very important to Australia. Can you go to the next slide, please? Don't know if you can actually read the numbers, and they're not overly important. If I look at our export commodities first, they say our top 10, coal, iron ore, gold, crude petroleum, natural gas, aluminium ores, copper, aluminium itself, beef and medicaments. So perhaps the major change from colonial days, excuse me, is there's more minerals than there was agriculture. And if you look at our trading partners, the biggest ones are East Asia, Japan and North Asia, Southeast Asia, then South Asia, and then Europe. And you might want to think about that in the context of our commitment to counter-piracy operations in the Gulf. Most of our trade is actually into Asia. Quite importantly, for our trade to get to North Asia, most of the time it will have to go through Southeast Asia or skirt Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, that sort of thing. That's another unstated reason why we actually want political stability within our region. It actually is for freedom of navigation. And particularly important is Indonesia in that regard. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay, if we look at imports, our biggest imports are cars, crude petroleum, refined petroleum, medicaments, gold, telecommunications equipment, computers, vehicles, pumps and electronics. And again, it's a matter of what we decide. Do we want to make this ourselves or import it because it's cheaper? Petroleum becomes interesting because quite often it's in our interest to actually export it straight from the wellhead instead of bringing it ashore to actually refine. And again, a lot of what we produce, we actually can't use. The refineries in Asia are bigger, and it's easy to actually send it offshore and import something else. Now, if we look at imports, our major trading partners are Southeast Asia, East Asia, Europe, and then Japan and North Asia. So again, the importance of the sea lines of communication in our area are of interest. And I'll certainly note when we look at our trade, and it is, a very large volume, and as we'll hear during the course of this session, the actual ownership, or under the Australian flag, our national fleet is very, very small, which means the bulk of our trade is actually carried by foreign-owned or foreign-flagged ships. And from a naval perspective, that means it's actually very difficult for you to actually protect it, because you don't really have the legal jurisdiction, and the Sea Power Centre has actually published a book about that. That's really all I wanted to say just as an introduction. So if I now hand over to Commander David Neumann, who's from our MTO branch, and he's going to talk about the protection of shipping. Thanks, David.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to share some thoughts with you this morning on maritime trade operations and trade protection. After a brief introduction, I want to talk about three issues, namely the need to protect maritime shipping and trade, the risks to shipping and trade, and specialist capabilities that have and can contribute to operations that involve shipping and trade. I'll finish my presentation this morning by offering you some thoughts for the future. The Royal Australian Navy unit that I belong to, Maritime Trade Operations Team 1, has its genesis in 1917, when the Naval Control Service was formed by the British Admiralty to provide staff for the control of merchant shipping and the organisation of convoys. Maritime Trade Operations, or MTO as we call it, is known in other countries as the Naval Cooperation and Guidance of Shipping, or NCAGS. Australia's first experience in trade protection came during World War I, when the Royal Australian Navy protected Allied shipping both off the Australian coast and internationally. During World War II, shipping and trade was again protected in many theatres by elements of the RAN. After providing assistance during the Iran-Iraq tank war in the Persian Gulf, the Navy actively protected maritime shipping and infrastructure during the First Gulf War that commenced a maritime security presence in the Middle East that continues today, albeit with a changing focus as strategic priorities have evolved. In sum, Australia has a proud history protecting both shipping and trade. MTO and NCAGS units in allied countries are staffed primarily by Naval Reserve personnel whose purpose is to provide support to military commanders and merchant shipping in peacetime, tension, crisis and conflict through cooperation and guidance, and where necessary, the supervision of commercial shipping. Additionally, guidance, advice and assistance is provided to commercial shipping interests to enhance the safety of their ships and to advance maritime industry support to military operations. MTO's primary NATO-based doctrine has evolved from its Cold War origin to provide relevant tools that are in operational use today. The management of some 1,600 ships continuing onto Libya and 6,000 odd ships in proximate trade routes during the recent sanction enforcement operation was achieved by the trade operations-focused NATO Shipping Centre using standard tools for area management, communication, vessel reporting, position tracking and ship deconfliction. In Australia, we have additionally focused on team membership in order to more effectively support emerging operational demands, recruiting from backgrounds such as customs, quarantine, police, port management, shipping agents, stevedores, as well as merchant navy officers. One of the most frequent questions I come across is the protection of trade really necessary today? I believe the answer is yes, based on three key points. Firstly, the economic importance of maritime trade. Secondly, the inherent vulnerabilities of shipping. And finally, the risks to that shipping. International maritime trade is crucial for the national security and prosperity of maritime countries, including Australia, enabling both national and military supply chains. Last year, for example, shipping enabled approximately 23% of Australia's $1.5 trillion economy, handling about 95% of annual imports and exports. Sea transport remains the most efficient and effective means of moving the majority of trade, given the commodities traded, the volumes involved, and generally access to and the distances between trading partners. The safe, reliable supply of goods is even more important today due to the widespread adoption of just-in-time philosophies for supply and manufacture that has reduced traditional warehousing, stockpiling and strategic reserves, and leading to a corresponding rise in the criticality of those goods. A pertinent commodity, as an example, is petroleum. Most nations hold significantly less than the International Energy Agency requirement for 90-day strategic stockpile. Australian stock holdings of imported crude oil typically provide between 5 to 15 days of refinery consumption, with terminals holding between 5 to 10 days of retail consumption. Whilst these levels are above world averages, ensuring adequate supply in the event of any emergency will require active forethought, especially with regard to remote communities and the lead time necessary to reactivate refineries. Commercial ships also need to be protected because they're inherently vulnerable. I've summarised my discussions with commercial ship masters over several years and experience in the Middle East into 4 themes: ship design, crew composition, other aspects including corporate capacity, and of course, trade routes used. Commercial vessels are designed primarily around maximum and efficient cargo movement towards profitability. So whilst security is a design consideration, it is more from an environmental and petty theft type security aspect rather than from potential aggressors of either a transnational or nation-state guise. There is not, as far as I'm aware, a design standard that seeks to improve the physical security of new commercial ships based on recent experiences. The element of security, I believe, is largely seen by industry as the responsibility of national navies and coastguards, and this raises its own issues for shippers and cargo owners who cannot rely on security provided by flag states that maintain maritime forces of limited size and effectiveness, such as, say, Panama, Libya and Monrovia. Those naval professionals in the audience will understand the lesser effectiveness provided by add-ons and retrofits to critical systems that are not part of a yard-based or systematic design package, but rather installed by a crew of minimum size. The generally larger physical dimensions of merchant ships have also not proven to be effective barriers to merchant ship security incidents, in port or at sea. And we have seen large ships with high freeboards regularly pirated in the Indian Ocean region. It is also worth noting that the relatively slower speeds and modest manoeuvrability of commercial vessels also contributes to their vulnerability. Increasing sizes of ships whilst expanding profitability margins adds to crew pressure during security situations in terms of maintaining effective awareness over larger ship areas. While technology can assist here, crew numbers have generally not been increased sufficiently to be effective. A ship's crew can also contribute to vulnerability, noting that there is significant variance across the maritime industry. Generally, a crew is organised by a management agency and provided to a ship's master, the master most often having little or no influence. Larger companies have recognised this problem and seek to develop long relationships with a few manning agencies towards a more effective and known crew composition. The master of a vessel, however, can be faced with a multinational crew without a common language, leading to communication problems, clashing cultural issues, inconsistent training and experience, including in security-type operations, and minimum crew numbers, averaging around 20, but fewer at times. Security checks of crew have in the past been at times ineffective, inadequate, and sometimes compromised. I've already mentioned the limited capacity of a minimum or economic crew to conduct additional security activities, such as maintaining additional and enduring lookouts. It's also worth noting that the team effectiveness of a crew, while some drills are conducted, is not established in the same way a Navy crew is prior to undertaking operations. Culturally based mistrust within crew members for security-type forces, including navies, can hinder efforts to gain accurate information during security incidents, and that's despite the potential danger that they may be facing. While some companies have more recently sought to overcome the limitations of crew vulnerability by augmenting their ships with private security detachments or security escort ships, their use is not widespread, in part of a result of their high cost, but also because, until recently, the use of such security measures was actively discouraged by major organisations, including the International Maritime Organisation. Other aspects of ship vulnerability is its corporate component. Smaller shippers, perhaps surprisingly, exist in considerable numbers in some regions, approaching 40% of ships when I was in the Middle East. They can be family or individually owned and often run from home or out of a small office, as you see pictured above. This can result in little contact after sailing and poor communication in English, despite the requirement for 24/7 company security contact. This challenges efforts to positively identify a ship and its cargo when calls for help are received. Even some large shippers, surprisingly, up until a few years ago, refused to admit that they were vulnerable to threats and did not implement countermeasures, that is, until they were pirated. Small shipping enterprises also do not have either the capacity or wherewithal to implement effective security requirements, not knowing what to believe on the internet, and not being able to afford the services of security or intelligence for hire. This leads to the poor preparedness of their ships to tackle pirates currently, and their inability to counter any systemic fears, misinformation and perceptions amongst their crew. A large number of entities and therefore respective nations can be involved in an individual ship and its voyage, increasing the time needed to make positive identification and obtain necessary permissions for security operations. The differing entities can be in terms of ship ownership, charter and use, finance, management, agents and representatives, operation, flag state, and insurance for hull and machinery. It can also include crew management, cargo ownership, and its related insurance, which, as you can imagine, on something like a container ship, can be hundreds, if not thousands, of organisations on some of the bigger ships. Commercial competition militates ready information sharing, which in turn can inhibit awareness to manage emerging security operations. Again, variance occurs across the maritime industry. However, this is more prevalent in trades where vessel position or pre-positioning can provide commercial advantages. Fishing, salvage and spot market bulk cargoes are examples that come to mind. Finally, the proximity of a ship's trade routes to threats affects their vulnerability. While today about 35% of Australian maritime trade is potentially threatened by Somali pirates, this could change instantly should access to current Asian-sourced oil become unavailable in an emergency. The economic drivers that govern commercial business also create sea highways that become broadly known, as you can see on the slide. Sailing times, destination and origin ports, and even pictorials such as this, are available in the public domain either through the internet or print media. In 2001, for example, 2 MTO officers of a non-navigation background were assigned to opposition forces for a multinational exercise held here in Australia. They were not given access to internet or corporate maritime industry information sources, but instead one copy of a printed industry shipping gazette that contained departure and arrival information for regular shipping services. Using this information and direct routing, within the 2-week exercise period, they were able to achieve a 50% accuracy rate for ships entering the exercise area for overseas ports. And the way that we tested this is we broadcast a prediction every day to all the ships that were on the opposition force, and the ships were pinging back to us each day the ships that they'd seen, where they'd seen them, and the time that they'd seen them. And by the end of the exercise, we had a 50% hit. The ability of a ship's master to deviate from a planned route or speed can be inhibited by contractual terms of individual voyages, requiring corporate pre-clearance prior to executing any change, with failure potentially resulting in post-voyage penalties. Large parts of the world proximate to trade routes also have inconsistent coverage by civil or military rescue coordination response capabilities, affecting the ability of ships to communicate security alerts. This includes busy regional routes in the Pacific, around Africa and through the Indian Ocean. While in the Middle Eastern region, as an example, I tried to call various internationally gazetted maritime rescue coordination centres to verify Mayday and EPIRB alerts. I experienced inconsistent operating hours, not always being 24/7, poor English, despite it being the international maritime language, and incorrect contact information, resulting in me dealing with Falmouth Coast Guard in the United Kingdom and the Australian Rescue Coordination Centre in Canberra. On the other hand, as a comparison, an Iranian National Guard maritime unit was very engaging, professional and timely in helping me respond to a SOLAS incident. Real threats to shipping exist in the current environment, primarily today in terms of Somali piracy. However, Asian piracy continues, albeit to a lesser degree. Ongoing Somali piracy continues to increase in frequency, with commensurate increases in insurance premiums, crew costs, and of course the ransoms paid. While only a small proportion of vessels become directly affected, the other costs discussed are borne by all. The number of worldwide piracy incidents continues to grow annually, with Somali-related incidents currently forming the greatest proportion. The future maritime security environment is, as we're told, forecast to contain both continued transnational and potentially emerging non-state-based threats, emanating from things including declining resources, increased populations, and from a range of disaster-related events. In short, the future predictions suggest that shipping will be carrying commodities that everybody will want more of, with a corresponding declining ability of many to afford, making shipping an attractive target to many. What appears clear from a scan of maritime history is that transnational maritime threats continue to impact shipping, and naval operations in time of war can span the spectrum from piracy to sea robbery to full naval battle that has included attacks on shipping in the past. So what MTO and NK's capabilities have been used and could be called upon to support future operations? The United Kingdom's MTO unit, UK MTO, based in Dubai, has contributed to the safety of shipping for over 10 years on a 24/7 basis. The unit contributes to an enhanced regional common operating picture with an obvious focus on shipping and trade. UK MTO is the primary regional point of contact for commercial shipping in the operational area with military forces regarding their safety, including SOLAS incidents that I've discussed previously. The unit continues to interact with some 600 to 800 ships at sea daily and conduct in-port briefings on merchant ships to reinforce anti-piracy measures and provide greater situational awareness to the industry. Post-incident debriefs provided by the industry and facilitated by UK MTO's regional professional reputation have contributed to situational awareness regarding regional piracy. A further contributor to awareness has been the sea riding of MTO types on commercial ships through the internationally recognised transit corridor. Two other military units are also focused on protection of shipping in the area, namely the NATO Shipping Centre and the Maritime Security Centre Horn of Africa, who together coordinate independent group sailings and convoys of merchant ships. From a planning perspective, it's worth noting that some 200 land-based personnel are working on the safety of commercial shipping off the Horn of Africa, in addition to the many at sea and in the air on military platforms. These 200 people are focused on a relatively small and defined maritime area with a large amount of shipping, primarily transnational threats, and generally without the pressure of making priority-based decisions about what ships or trade will or won't be protected in order to resupply communities. The ongoing augmentation of UK MTO, provided primarily by Australia and the United States in the form of international liaison officers, has proven to boost the average number of ships briefed in port by a factor of at least 5, thereby increasing the number of ships regionally with greater situational awareness. The United States have deployed their NCAG's capability twice recently in humanitarian assistance and the disaster response operations. In 2010, in response to the Haitian earthquake, US NCAGs coordinated and synchronised and, where appropriate, supplemented the commercial maritime industry until organic Haitian capacity was re-established. This included re-establishing the pilot station and running harbour services and vessel traffic management functions. This effort demonstrated the capacity of NCAGs or MTO units to support the establishment of sea points of disembarkation or SPODs for joint operations. In 2011, US NCAGs deployed in response to the Japanese tsunami. In addition to advising Japanese authorities, outcomes contributed to the re-establishment of an effective common operating picture and the improved situational awareness of commercial ships owners and agents operating in the area. Another capability is the Information Fusion Centre, or IFC, in Singapore, that facilitates cooperation between navies, coastguards and other maritime agencies through the effective sharing of information on maritime security challenges, including threats to shipping and trade. In April 2010, the IFC had liaison officers from 10 countries, including Australia, providing extensive links into respective government agencies that then impacts on the quality of information provided. Australia's Maritime Trade Operations Team 1 comprises both naval warfare and maritime industry qualified personnel. Since 2000, it has provided the Australian Defence Force with an enduring duty team, in addition to deployed support to numerous operations, including those in the Middle East, East Timor, the Solomon Islands, and more recently Queensland Flood Assist in 2011. In 2010, we moved to co-locate with Australia's Border Protection Command, Australia's focus centre for maritime security, supporting defence, border protection and other government agencies. Additionally, in 2010, Team 1 commenced supporting UK MTO via annual deployments of personnel, and today we are progressing our third rotation. Team 1 also manages the Navy and Maritime Industry Familiarisation Program that seeks to generate more effective, mutually beneficial relationships through primarily short-period exchange experiences at sea in each other's ships. Australia, through Team 1, is also a founding member of the Pacific and Indian Ocean Shipping Working Group that seeks to facilitate improved interoperability amongst nations for operations involving maritime trade. From the operational employment of allied MTO and NCAGs units have come a number of lessons. Firstly, the employment of MTO or NCAGs in early planning phases refreshes industry contacts necessary for deployed operations and enables the use of team members with relevant industry experience in those operational areas. Secondly, the deployment of MTO or NCAGs expertise in any advanced parties can generate effective relationships with local industry that can smooth the paths necessary to achieve operational outcomes. Thirdly, use MTO or NCAGs as the military point of contact with industry within an operational area. Multiple contacts creates confusion within the industry, who in turn become frustrated when contacted by numerous agencies during an emergency, all of whom want detailed information and claim to be their contact with government and military authorities. I've seen this occur in Australia and overseas, resulting in information pipelines from industry slam shut, requiring extensive work to overcome. So, with enduring and potential threats in the future environment, where do I think we need to go? As I explained earlier, the globalised shipping industry is complex, with a multitude of interested entities and their respective nations, all with varying degrees of current engagement, differing views, requirements and priorities. Currently, there is nothing that aligns all of these entities to a necessary common goal, the safe, timely and arrival of shipping that facilitates trade, especially in scenarios where priority-based decisions will affect what is or is not protected. What is required, I believe, to address this gap is a trade protection strategy that could enable the scaling of operational successes that have occurred in, say, the Malacca Strait, off Africa and the Middle East, to protect the maritime, scaling to the predicted maritime environment. Such a strategy with an enabling plan would provide the focus and redirection mechanism to align these entities, potentially including the maritime industry, towards a greater degree of self-help or reliance. It would ensure that we are prepared to conduct more complex trade operations before being called upon to do so. Ideally, this strategy would be worldwide. However, realistically, a regional strategy, while still facing political, diplomatic and bureaucratic challenges, I see as more achievable. A number of key steps which I see as both elements to the strategy and also first steps can achieve progress now. First, other and more broad maritime organisations need to be engaged, including the industry, academia and non-government organisations, the latter often having significant maritime interests in the operational areas of maritime forces. Secondly, exercises need to reflect the maritime industry in more realistic terms, and exercises need to expand to include trade protection that exercises broader industry and government mechanisms, vice just the protection of a ship or an in-company group. Also, education needs to occur in public, industry, military and government arenas to commence broader dialogue on the protection of trade, particularly the criticality of trade to a nation's economy. And finally, MTO or NCAGs units should be engaged early in planning phases to appreciate trade considerations early. That concludes my presentation and I thank you. The details on the screen may be used to contact my team at any stage, and I look forward to discussions with you shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, David. Our next speaker will be Captain Jenny Daetz, who's the Deputy Hydrographer for Australia, and she will talk about the contribution of the Australian Hydrographic Service to Australian trade.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We all know that a motorist wouldn't drive a vehicle with his eyes closed. We also hope that the captain and the first officer flying you to your destination is also keeping a good lookout. And we know, as mariners, we are obliged to keep a very good lookout whilst on the seas. However, unlike the land navigation and air navigation, the mariner has to challenge with an additional obstruction called water. He cannot see through water, and thus the reliance for the nautical chart. It was once considered that any data that was made to inform the mariner on how to get from one port to another was better than nothing. But today, due to economic and environmental pressures, as well as maritime industry expectations, The information on the chart must be reliable, of high quality and current. Yet maritime incidents still happen. Hydrographic officers across the globe continually work towards acquiring quality data and then producing products that best assist the mariner to navigate safely. In Australia, the National Hydrographic Authority is the Australian Hydrographic Service, which is a branch of the Royal Australian Navy. It is responsible for the timely delivery of reliable products that meet the requirements of the maritime community. The nautical chart is just but one of those products, and any information that cannot be easily depicted on a chart is contained in complementing products and publications. With ever-increasing traffic, larger ships, tighter timeframes, economic pressures, and competition for limited resources and facilities, these roads or sea lanes are constantly under increasing pressure. Shorter and more direct routes are continually sought. Some existing sea lanes need to be wider or deeper, and additional parking bays or anchorages are needed. These pressures only increase the need for reliable, timely and regular updates for charts and publications. Hydrographic surveying and charting conducted by the Royal Australian Navy is a direct consequence of Australia's significant reliance on maritime trade for economic prosperity. Sometimes it's easier to highlight the importance of a service by assessing the impact if it were to cease or did not exist. However, 25,000 commercial voyages in Australia each year, equating to more than $300 billion of trade and greater than 99% of trade by weight, it is not worth the risk, let alone the risk to lives, livelihoods, or the environment. The provision of hydrographic services is essential. In earlier years, countries used navies to pioneer new trade routes. Then they needed to protect these routes and the valuable cargo. But to do this, they needed knowledge of the seas and the oceans to enable freedom of manoeuvre. This saw the development of hydrography. And during these years, the hydrographic information was zealously guarded as it gave countries the commercial advantage to safe access to foreign ports. Eventually, this data was shared for the benefit of commerce and also for improving safety of life at sea. The theme for World Hydrography Day this year is focused on the international hydrographic cooperation and how it supports safer navigation. Hydrography is a science which provides the fundamental information for all maritime operations. In addition to seaborne trade, modern maritime operations include tourism, security, port management, management of coastal zones, climatology and inundation modelling, let alone all the numerous defence applications. Open any Australian port's annual report over the past decade and the statements of actual increase and forecasted increase are common themes. The state of the terrestrial infrastructure to move the goods and freights in and out of these ports has deservedly received renewed attention. But whilst it's easy to recognise the terrestrial congestion, the offshore, and as CN highlighted yesterday, out of sight, out of mind networks are often overlooked. Significant areas of Australian waters remain unsurveyed or poorly surveyed. Some of these areas are adjacent future plan ports and offshore facilities. Whilst ports and commercial operators have the responsibility for surveying their own ports and these offshore installations, it is the highways which link these facilities, which remains a national task. Regardless of who conducts the hydrographic survey, it's the Australian Hydrographic Service which is the charting authority. By having one national authority engaged regionally and internationally and signatory to the standards and specifications of the International Hydrographic Organisation, a level of consistency is ensured for the global mariner whilst they're in Australian waters. With the assistance of other governments such as AMSA and the National Maritime Safety Authority in Papua New Guinea, areas requiring surveys as well as new products and publications are prioritised into a surveying and charting program known as the Hydro Scheme. It is published annually and it lists the charting and publication program which is fulfilled by the men and women in the Australian Hydrographic Office. And it also lists the surveys to be undertaken by the hydrographic fleet. The size of the task always exceeds the resources available, but Navy has proven it can also augment its organic capability with contracted surveys to meet government priorities. But not all hydrographic surveying tasks can be planned. This time last year, Queensland Flood Assist saw the RAN survey fleet deploy at short notice to provide clearance confirmation surveys of Brisbane River and Moreton Bay. This was an essential task prior to the resumption of port operations, not only because Brisbane is one of Australia's busiest ports, but in this instance, it was logistically essential for the clean-up. As the flood situation in the southeast Queensland began to stabilise, North Queensland encountered Tropical Cyclone Yasi. The Navy deployed a survey ship to Townsville for a port clearance survey, and less than 48 hours after the cyclone had lashed the coast, business was able to resume at the port. Again, a vital logistic link for recovery in the region. The Australian portfolio of paper charts is in excess of 450. However, it has been proven time and time again that when relying on the paper chart alone, maritime incidents still occur, even in well-surveyed areas. In order to reduce the risk of grounding, the International Maritime Organisation encourages all vessels to use smart data in combination with real-time positioning in a computer-based system. It is anticipated that the employment of an electronic chart display and information system, ECDIS, will lead to at least 30% reduction in groundings worldwide. An internal study conducted in the Australian Hydrographic Office has confirmed this view. Of 240 incidents in Australia over a 25-year period, 71 were groundings. 36 of these were the result of the mariner losing situational awareness, simply losing the plot. A fix on a paper chart only informs the mariner where their position was, if it was plotted accurately. And unless the next chart is referred to, it's not readily apparent what lies ahead. An ECDIS constantly informs the mariner where he or she is in relation to dangers, what lies ahead, as there are no chart boundaries, and with warning functionality enabled, alerts the mariner to potential hazards. An ECDIS is the real-time eyes for the mariner on what lay beneath and ahead, as opposed to a paper chart, which is a snapshot of the past and an estimate of the future. But of course, an ECDIS will not save all mariners from grounding, especially if he or she chooses not to use the system, or if the warning or alarms are turned off or ignored, or the operator has not been trained in the correct operation of the system. In 2008, the IMO mandated from July this year, Solus-class vessels, as indicated on this chart, will commence mandatory carriage of ECDIS. The phasing is over the next 6 years. For us in the Australian Hydrographic Office, the introduction of ECDIS, as well as the ongoing demand for intimate knowledge of the seabed, has resulted in a number of projects and initiatives. An ECDIS, of which there are many types, requires foundation data through the provision of the Electronic Navigation Charts, or ENCs. This saw the production of approximately 800 ENCs, covering ports and major shipping lanes between the equator and Antarctica, around Australia and Papua New Guinea. It is essential for the global mariner that it is a seamless transition from one chart or one cell to another, not only within Australia's charting area, but also when transiting between other areas. This resulted in the AHS simultaneously embarking on a chart modernisation project. The mariner could no longer accept switching between fathom and metric charts. Also, as ECDIS is reliant on GPS, there had to be one datum, namely WGS 84. This has been a significant project requiring most of the affected charts to be fully reconstructed from source data. This project is in its final stages and will be completed in time for the mandatory carriage of ECDIS in July this year. Now that these ENCs exist, it is just as important that they are readily available to the mariner. While Australian ENCs are already available through major international distributors, it can be difficult sometimes to acquire them. To assist with access within this region, the Australian Hydrographic Service is expanding its local distribution through existing chart agents with a plan to develop online services. Regional IHO member states see the benefit to the maritime community of a regional approach. So this service will be expanded to include these charting areas on a voluntary basis. This will especially benefit the regional operators. It will complement existing international distribution arrangements, and it's in the spirit of the International Hydrographic Cooperation for supporting safer navigation. In a typical year, the AHS publishes approximately 1,300 notices to mariners. Mariners can now simply download the latest files, including temporary and preliminary notices. It's a load and go. Notice to mariners have been made available online free of charge for paper chart users since 2009. This has halved the lead times and improved the currency of information. It is assessed that the paper charts will be an essential navigation product for at least the immediate future. So the requirement for both paper and electronic products has effectively doubled our product base. In the meantime, advances in printer technology and a continuing drive for national product improvements has provided the impetus to review the way paper charts were printed. Previously, we relied on commercial printers, which resulted in lead times of up to 6 weeks. This meant that not only was there a requirement to predict future demands of chart orders, it also meant that by the time the chart arrived, the mariner would also receive a list of chart corrections. Printing charts on demand is realising a saving of 40% in production costs, but it's also saving the mariner significant time and effort in applying the corrections, and it also removes the risk of the corrections being applied inaccurately. However, not all information can be displayed on a chart or on a chart display system. And as requirements emerge, we endeavour to accommodate by remaining reactive to the needs of the mariner. For example, this publication, AHP 24, was published last year, and it's designed to take the guesswork out of maintaining any chart or publication and assist the mariner in meeting their international and national regulatory obligations. As mentioned earlier, increasing pressures on the maritime industry are driving the demand for new and wider sea lanes and higher accuracy charts. Areas such as the Torres Strait are choke points with no alternate options in the immediate vicinity. To improve seaborne trade efficiencies and at the same time maintain safe navigation, AMSA have introduced an underkeel clearance management system. Accurate real-time tides and high-order accuracy hydrographic surveys are essential in order to increase the tonnage, reduce the transit times, and meet critical time windows further along the route. The Navy has been supporting AMSA in this highly vulnerable and strategically significant area of Australia by providing these high-density, high-order surveys. Underkeel safety margins set by AMSA are continually being challenged by the maritime industry, which only increases the pressure for more accurate charts, leaving no room for error. It's worthy to acknowledge that the maritime environment is a hostile one, with many external influences for the navigator, the master, the pilot, but also for the surveyor. For our overseas visitors, here in Australia we have many creatures which start with the letter S that are cause for concern. Snakes, spiders, sharks, stonefish, stingers, stingrays, and saltwater crocodiles. Same can be said for the conditions and dangers found in restricted waterways, like the Torres Strait. And I believe there's one missing. That would be our survey ships systematically surveying backwards and forwards, right in front of the traffic that is restricted to these routes. The continual increase in seaborne trade has driven the demand for safer routes and new routes to be opened. Hydrographer's Passage, east of the Whitsunday Islands, saves 500 nautical miles for a round trip between Australia's coal ports and Asia. It also reduces the amount of time spent inside the sensitive Great Barrier Reef. Ladd's Passage reduces the voyage between Cairns and Cape York by approximately 18 nautical miles. It reduces the amount of traffic required to use the relatively narrow inner route and has reduced the risk of navigation by an estimated 30%. Overall, the benefits are threefold. Firstly, for some vessels, it removes the tidal window restrictions. Secondly, it allows faster transit. And thirdly, it provides the master and pilot time to rest, which assists fatigue management, a key factor for avoiding maritime incidents. Hydrographic surveying for nautical charting purposes is a painstaking and time-consuming activity, and the poor state of charts in some areas is preventing seaborne trade opportunities to be realised. Given the amount of unsurveyed or poorly surveyed waters around Australia and in neighbouring countries, the Australian Hydrographic Service is receptive to all data sources. However, some sectors of the maritime industry are still reluctant to share their information as they regard it as commercially sensitive. Our concern is that the bathymetric data can be used to update the chart to show all navigation hazards dangerous to surface shipping for the benefit of all mariners. International engagement is vital to effective seaborne trade in today's global environment. Significant changes remain in achieving an open data exchange to support safer navigation, which is essential for ensuring reliability, availability and seamless coverage. And thus the focus of this year's World Hydrography Day, which focuses on international hydrographic cooperation for safer navigation. Many neighbouring states in the Southwest Pacific do not have the means to provide charting coverage for their ports, their harbours or their approaches. Yet their livelihoods depend on the growing tour ship industry and increased trade opportunities. A recent visit to Port Vila by 2 Royal Australian Navy survey ships provided an opportunity for some vital hydrographic surveying to be conducted in the port. The Australian Hydrographic Service also assisted Papua New Guinea with achieving chart modernisation and published paper charts for East Timor. It has also taken a leadership role in the region in the provision of hydrographic training, and with the 3rd regional workshop to be held in Brisbane later this month, we will have 10 states attending. The Australian Hydrographic Office continues to improve its products and services that enable and improve the safety and efficiency of seaborne trade. While special maritime products are also produced to meet the unique operational requirements of defence, the majority of Navy's hydrographic products and services are focused on providing the fundamental product, that being the nautical chart, and the services to maintain currency, reliability and accuracy. Regardless of whether the chart is electronic or paper, it is the only means the mariner has to see a safe path enabling seaborne trade and freedom to manoeuvre in Australia's waters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. Our final speaker will be Mr. Noel Hart, who is the Chairman of the Australian Shipowners Association, and obviously he'll be talking about issues about Australian shipping industry. Noel.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for having me at this prestigious conference. As you just heard, my name is Noel Hart, and I'm Chairman of the Australian Shipowners Association. Through my role at ASA, I'm also currently Chairman of the Asian Shipowners Forum, whose members comprise more than half of the world's merchant fleet, and I'm a Director of the International Chamber of Shipping. I mention these as I think they and my roles here and overseas with BP Shipping enabled me to speak not just of Australian shipping, but for the industry in general. I'm also a Commissioner of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. Before I start, I should also thank Jenny and her team at the Hydrographic Office for their wonderful work in enhancing shipping safety and finding new trade routes for us and making shipping more economical where possible. Firstly, I want to touch briefly on the role of the Australian Shipowners Association. Although we celebrated our 25th anniversary last year as ASA, in fact our predecessor organisations go back over 100 years. We are a lobby and representative industry association with our main office in Melbourne. Our purpose is to ensure that an appropriate fiscal and legislative regime exists in Australia to sustain and develop a vibrant, competitive and sustainable Australian shipping industry, resulting in meaningful participation both in the domestic and international trades, and to make Australia a location of choice for the provision of sea transport and marine-related services. We do this by advocating, lobbying and promoting the industry. We spend a lot of time in Canberra. We provide an essential link between the industry, state and federal governments and other stakeholders, such as Navy, for example. We coordinate our members' views on industrial relations and human resources matters, and through our memberships and connections with the International Chamber of Shipping and the Asian Shipowners Forum, we provide the Australian voice in the international shipping community. We actively promote safety and environmental performance with our members and provide specialist advice to them, and we maintain a database of available seafaring jobs and match those with the number of seafarers seeking work to assist in employment and manpower planning. And I mentioned earlier our connections with the Asian Shipowners Forum and the International Chamber of Shipping. In May this year in Port Douglas, we're proudly hosting both these organisations for their annual general meetings and conferences in what we're calling an International Shipping Week. And we'd encourage the RAN to participate in some way there, and I'll communicate with you about that. This will be a major event with about 400 or 500 ship-owning representatives and industry associations assembling, and it's a great opportunity for networking. At ASA, we have a diverse group of member companies ranging from ship owners, ship managers, energy and mining companies, offshore exploration and production marine service companies, towage companies, port authorities and so on. You'll see them on the list there. As Andrew indicated earlier, the Australian shipping industry has unfortunately been in a steady state of decline in terms of the number of blue water vessels in the fleet for the last few decades. This is mainly due to the lack of supportive policies by various federal governments over the years, the high cost of employing Australian seafarers due to our wage and leave conditions, and competition from foreign shipping, which has lower employment costs and beneficial finance and tax regimes. Today we have only 24 Australian manned blue water trading vessels, and we have only 4 Australian flag ships in international trade, these being specialist LNG carriers. Now, given that Australia has the 4th largest tonne-mile sea task in the world, given that our ports handle over 10% of the entire world's sea trade, and that our exports alone are valued at over $200 billion annually, this is obviously well out of balance. So we're seeking to improve our participation as Australian shipping in that trade. On the other hand, our offshore marine industry and port services such as towage and pilotage are thriving due to the large number of massive oil and gas and mining developments which are both operational or being expanded or constructed. So Australian ships carry less than 0.5% of our international trade, and about 1/3 of our domestic trade is carried by foreign vessels. Our reliance on foreign shipping is equivalent to over 8% of the current account deficit of the country. So that's what the picture looks like for the number of Australian ships. It's not very bright, so talking about convoys and things earlier, there's not much to convoy in terms of our ships right now, but we're optimistic for the future, as I'll explain shortly. This slide indicates the number of seafarers employed by sector, and you'll see the offshore area is nearly half of our seafarers as things stand today. So our current federal government has recognised the importance of a vital national shipping industry, and importantly for this audience as well, for security reasons as well as economic reasons, and has realised that the state of the blue water part of our industry is at a critical stage. ASA has been a principal advocate for the industry and provided great input to the government for many years, this being especially so in the last few years as we've been talking about policy reform. and changes to our tax and legislative regimes such that we can compete more evenly with international shipping. We're not looking for handouts, we just want a level playing field. And it gives me great pleasure to advise you that from the 1st of July this year, such changes will be legislated. They include a number of tax and fiscal reforms, an Australian international or second register, a new licensing regime for coastal shipping, workplace skills development and coordination, and improvements to workplace efficiencies and costs. I won't go into them in detail here with you, but let me say that they are extremely important and significant, and they will make a real difference. So much so that we anticipate the fleet growing by about 50 to 60 ships in the near term. It is essential to the industry that this reform package passes through legislation in July, and I would encourage Chief of Navy and any of you here who have the opportunity to support it in discussions you may have with the government and other relevant parties. This slide shows what it could look like if all this goes ahead as we anticipate it will. The green curve obviously being the policy case. And this is all very timely, as Australia's export trade is set to boom even further than it is at the moment. It is expected to nearly double in the next 15 years, primarily in coal, iron ore, oil, LNG and grain. To give you some examples, China's appetite for imported iron ore, for example, has increased from 80 million tonnes a year in the year 2000 to 800 million tonnes a year last year. Our miners, Rio Tinto, BHP and Fortescue, currently have plans and are working on increasing their Pilbara production in the northwest of Australia from 435 million tonnes a year at the moment to 750 million tonnes a year by 2015. That's just a few years' time. Just this increase in iron ore alone equates to a further 2,100 shipments a year from that part of Australia. In LNG, Australia's current export production is around 20 million tonnes a year. With current planned new projects in Western Australia and Queensland, this will increase to 60 million tonnes a year by 2020, making us the world's second largest exporter behind Qatar in the Middle East of this vital energy source. So given the new shipping policies and the booming exports, we would like to think the future is bright for Australian shipping, but we still have much more hard work to do and can't be complacent. As I'm sure is the case for the Navy, recruitment, retention and training of seafarers is problematic. In terms of our relationship between Merchant Marine and the Navy, we can envisage improved linkages between the Merchant Navy and the RAN that could benefit both groups. And to this end, initiatives have been underway with the Navy through a working group of the Australian Maritime Defence Council to strengthen skills sharing between the RAN and the Merchant Marine, to explore career options for service personnel and to provide opportunities for both RAN and Merchant Navy personnel to gain experience in each other's sectors. We have several high-quality maritime training colleges in Australia. However, if the increase in our shipping industry that I mentioned is realised, then there will undoubtedly be constraints on these training institutions and in training the additional seafarers. Perhaps in this regard, it may be possible to come to an arrangement to utilise existing training facilities with the RAN. I referred to the government commenting that a strong shipping industry is important not just for economic and environmental reasons, but also for national security purposes. In times of regional conflict or natural disasters, almost invariably Defence would plan to charter additional shipping from both the Australian and international markets using the crews of the chartered ships. However, it's not difficult to imagine that there may be some scenarios in which it would be necessary to use only Australian ships and or seafarers to undertake particular operational tasks. In terms of opportunities for the Merchant Marine to support Navy, there are perhaps various fleet support vessels that Merchant Sea Staff could man. There we go. That Merchant Sea Staff could man and sail, such as fleet refuelers and supply vessels, freeing up the more specialist trained naval sea staff to be assigned to traditional combat vessels such as destroyers, patrol boats, submarines and the like. We have the belief that a strong and vibrant Australian shipping industry, including perhaps high-speed, versatile seacraft, potentially tailored with equipment, technology and merchant navy crews with ADF reserve qualifications, owned by Australian companies or operators, would help provide a more responsive readiness and preparedness capability to allow the government to more quickly meet emergent national security, peacekeeping, stabilisation or humanitarian contingencies. We understand that a domestic coastal shipping industry is perceived by Defence as a subset of the overall maritime industry operating in Australia's areas of national interest, which has two impacts. It's safeguarding by the ADF as directed in times of threat, but also its potential to provide value-added capability to Defence's delegated security roles, responsibilities and remit that the government assigns it. Having an experienced marine capability readily on hand provides more options to the government and greater responsiveness in time of need, but is also a force multiplier in that it is also an explicit deterrent to potential adversaries. Hence, there is a view that while the ADF per se has a specific assigned remit towards which it will develop, train and sustain with its own assigned resources, having a robust merchant maritime base that intimately understands and is skilled in all areas of marine expertise would provide even greater surety, backup and optionality in meeting the government's requirements. Any initiatives that go towards securing that readily available support, be they nurturing military shipbuilding in Australia, providing infrastructure or skilled mariners of all types ashore and afloat, or facilitating a broader commercial Australian shipping base that grows those elements, can only increase the government's confidence in meeting its national and regional security obligations, reducing national security risk and deterring those who might seek harm. I would also like to put in a plug for my ASA members, many of whom have significant technical and operational expertise and resources. They would be delighted to become more actively involved in providing services to the Royal Australian Navy. In short, a thriving Australian shipping industry will provide a broader base to nurture the underlying skills and experience necessary for augmenting Australia's naval and border protection capability and therefore our national security. Being an island trading nation, security of the seas and keeping our sea lanes open for trade is critical. So too is protecting our coastline and economic exclusion zone from illegal fishing, people smuggling, drug trade and terrorism, not to mention safeguarding the strategic offshore and oil and gas developments. And Navy and Border Protection work extremely well together in this essential role. Today, though, I want to take this opportunity to also highlight the issue of piracy. Actually, I prefer to call it terrorism on the high seas. The impression of piracy is almost romantic to the average person in the street. This terrorism of the high seas off the Horn of Africa and now extending well into the Indian Ocean to the coast of India. This is a massive issue which seems to have no plan for a permanent solution. On behalf of the Australian Shipowners Association, the Asian Shipowners Forum and the International Chamber of Shipping, I'd like to thank you and all your colleagues from the many navies around the world who are helping combat these terrorists of the seas and to safeguard merchant ships and sea staff that trade through the region. We know it is not an easy task for you and there are severe limitations in what you're able to do. You may be assured that the international ship-owning community is doing a great deal to help protect itself through compliance with industry best practice procedures, in convoys through the Gulf of Aden, through self-defence measures and through crew training on ships, and now also in many cases by employing armed guards on ships. In fact, the International Maritime Organisation is just about to issue revised guidelines to ship owners on the use of privately contracted armed security personnel on board ships in the high-risk area. There's a bit of a debate in the shipping industry about the effectiveness of putting our own armed personnel on ships as well, because all that seems to happen is that the terrorists just come back with bigger and better weapons themselves, and so you escalate. And they also tend to know which ships have armed security personnel and which ships don't. So their intelligence network has improved over the years. I'd like to quote from a letter from the Save Our Sailors campaign, which is a shipping industry campaign focused on finding a permanent solution and protecting seafarers. It says, if this situation continues, there is a real risk that the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea, and the entire Indian Ocean could become restricted zones for shipping, in that seafarers could simply refuse to sail into warlike attacks, captivity, and the nightmare of suffering that follows, or that ship owners will not put their ships and crews at further risk. Using alternative routes will play havoc with freight costs, and there is no alternative to sailing through the area for over 40% of all seaborne oil trade, which originates from the Arabian Gulf region. I know when I was General Manager of Northwest Shelf Shipping, the LNG shipping company over in the West, we had some spot LNG contracts that were to be delivered to Europe, which would have gone through that area, and my decision was to send the ships via the Cape of Good Hope. I just couldn't anticipate sending LNG carriers through there. As it turned out, those contracts never went ahead, but the amount of soul searching and discussion around where best to send the ships was amazing. We are, and I'm sure a lot of ship owners are doing that every day. We are lobbying the IMO and the UN for a coordinated international approach to the root cause of the issues within Somalia itself, and as well in the meantime, how best to protect ships and seafarers from hijack and kidnapping. I know that if I was still at sea on merchant ships, I would not be relishing the thought of sailing through those waters, and I find it hard to understand how this situation can continue. In fact, the pirates are becoming better armed, have more technology and intelligence, and apparently have little fear. There are still some 172 merchant seafarers held hostage and 10 ships held hostage, and the estimated cost of piracy to the world community is something like $12 billion a year. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all hope that a permanent solution is found soon, but in the meantime, thank you for your efforts in protecting merchant seafarers, and thank you for having me here today at this wonderful event. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Noel. We now have a lot of time available for Q&A. Different to yesterday, we actually now have 4 microphones on stands. If people would just line up to ask questions. And while people are thinking about whether they will ask questions, and again, there should be questions, not comment, and a single question, not a multi-purpose sort of question. But I'll take the chairman's prerogative. I've got a number of questions while people think about what they might want to do. First of all, for Noel, and this is more perhaps for the international shipping industry, not on the Australian side of the fence, but sitting in the Department of Defence, I've always found it interesting that the shipping industry wants the Navy to get out there and stop the piracy, say, off Somalia, but they don't want navies to retake ships, and they're willing to always pay the ransom. Now, I know why they want to pay the ransom, but there is a major disconnect, which is how can navies actually stop piracy when ransoms have been paid, which encourage your terrorists at sea actually doing it?
It's a very difficult situation. I know some countries in the world have laws that stop ransoms being paid as well, which makes it difficult, because then if you do it, what insurance and other, you know, you're violating some laws, so insurance protection and cover is difficult. However, if you're a ship owner and you've got 30 of your seafarers held hostage, and leave aside the value of the ship and the cargo, but you've got 30 people there held hostage, and you have their families phoning you and you're trying to deal with that. And there isn't really any other way. People aren't going to go into Somalia and take them out necessarily. It's difficult. The other difficulty about paying ransoms, or with the hostage situation, is that it's becoming quite an art now, in that some hostages are on-sold to other organisations, So the Somalis take the hostages and then they sell them, and those organisations then try to seek the ransoms. So the Somalis themselves become brokers, if you like, and do the operational work. So it's a very difficult and complex discussion. I would pay the ransom if I thought I'd get my people out, unless there was a viable alternative, a military solution for doing it. This is why we talk about a permanent political solution which has to take place in Somalia with the government or a government in Somalia or some form of organisation there that you can deal with. Because as you're well aware of the piracy extending with motherships going further into the Indian Ocean. The coastal zones are no longer just the areas where they're taken. They have intelligence, they know what ships are approaching. They know which ships have armed guards on them because they see where the guards get on and off. So we're looking at different ways of doing that. It's a nightmare. And it just, I know a lot of the navies, depending on from which governments or which countries they come, whether there's a legal process for dealing with pirates in those home countries and whether they can be taken or not. So it's really just destroy their assets or put a blockade around Somalia and stop them coming out in the first place. I don't know.
Yeah, Neil James from the Australia Defence Association. A question for Noel. Would the ASA support an Australian government or other initiative to change the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea so the pirates can be killed? The only way you're going to solve this problem, they're the common enemies of mankind, is to go back to the old international law where any naval vessel coming to a pirate vessel could open fire without warning and finish them.
I'm not sure the terminology of rewriting or supporting a change in legislation for killing pirates, but certainly that would allow pirates to be taken prisoner and be tried in a court of law and dealt with in a proper judicial process. I know that sounds soft, but I think that's the way it would have to work. So we'd support anything that gave more power to any navy there to take hostages out of their vessels and take them ashore for trial and imprisonment.
With all due respect, Noel, we've tried that. You know, the different legal regimes in the countries of the Indian Ocean just aren't working. The solution of handing them over for trial to a literal country isn't working. The only solution is vigorous police and military action.
Well, I would certainly support destroying any of their assets. In some of the organisations that I'm involved with, there's been talk of suggestions of we don't understand, or people don't understand why there's not a naval blockade or some form of more intense surveillance of the coastal strips of Somalia to avoid them coming out. Any vessel going in and out of Somalia and the area should be intercepted and weapons and assets seized and destroyed, things like that. That may happen without our knowledge, I don't know, but I don't think so. So, I mean, killing the pirates probably isn't the answer because they're just going to bob up somewhere else. I think any measure that helps eliminate them and control them, certainly, and stops their cause is what's needed.
Good morning. Michael Rothwell, Royal Australian Navy. It's a good follow-on to the previous question, actually. If you accept that the root cause of piracy is poverty, what are associations like yours, Mr. Hart, doing to address that?
Sorry, I missed the last bit. I heard that if we accept that poverty...
I said if you accept that the root cause of piracy is poverty, what are associations like yours doing to address that?
What are associations like mine doing to address poverty? I think that's a difficult one as well. I think if there was an answer to poverty, would be doing pretty well. I think the reason you're probably aware that the Somali piracy emerged was because a lot of foreign fishing fleets went in and decimated their fishing grounds, and so these guys emerged as being fishermen. I think, however, having got a taste of this type of lifestyle, I can't see that they would go back to fishing personally. So I think really the answer is still to do with a political solution within the country of Somalia itself, and having some sort of credible government and legal system there. Some of our ship owner members and our associations support organisations that assist in the process of knowledge and coordination of anti-piracy affairs. I don't think we have the means or the knowledge or the capability to go in and sort of solve poverty in Somalia.
We'll go down the front and then up the back.
Leach, former Australian naval person, given the importance of sea transport that you've stated, 23% of the economy, and I can't understand how we've got to a situation where we have 24 Australian flagships when we anticipate we're going to double our trade in the next 15 years. You said the government is moving with initiatives to improve the situation, that we can get another 50 to 60 ships. I don't know in what time frame, but could you tell us what initiatives, what legislation, and what you see as being the important ones that are going to be passed? Is it tax? Is it depreciation? Is it curbing the unions? How do you see it acting and when?
Okay, thank you. There are a number of things. Some of the tax initiatives themselves and alone are significant. Australian shipping will be tax-free. There's a whole load of definitions into what that means, but basically, under most scenarios, Australian ship owners would pay zero tax. They will have accelerated depreciation for new vessels, so I think they can write down a new vessel over a 10-year period. There will be no withholding tax on bareboat charters, for instance. So if a ship owner wanted to lease a ship for, say, 5 years and bring one in that's already built rather than going off and constructing a brand new ship, the way things stand at the moment is that that ship owner would have to pay a withholding tax, which is also quite significant, on that lease. There'll be no withholding tax in the future. So that means you can bareboat a ship in and pay no tax on bringing it in, and its lease over that, whatever period the lease is. There'll be no tax on seafarers who spend more than 6 months a year trading overseas on Australian ships. So that would mean that, what that means is the seafarer would earn the same net salary, but the ship owner would retain the value of their tax payments. So that reduces the wages bill, if you like, for the seafarers. So there's a number of measures on tax which are all significant. The international register requires only a minimum of 2 Australians on the ship, so we can have mixed manning on our international ships, which is significant. The licensing arrangements for coastal shipping will be tightened up to what they are today, still allowing foreign vessels to trade on the coast, but under a different licensing arrangement, which is designed to, I guess, not make it quite as freely available as it is now to foreign shipping under the current permit system. So it should encourage Australian ship owners to want to invest in ships on coastal trades as well, because they'll be able to compete a bit more readily, again without any handouts. And we're also working with the unions on reducing our cost base at the same time and gaining some workplace efficiencies, which will help as well. There's some systematic things in our industry which have a cost burden but don't necessarily add a great deal of value or can be done in other ways. So we're working on those sorts of things as well. On the coastal ships, we'll be able to have overseas riding crews to do a lot of the maintenance, which currently isn't able to be done. So that means that our dry dock costs will be less when we go to dry dock because we'll have been able to do maintenance more efficiently with our riding crews. What else was there? There'll be a coordinated training regime. There'll be a panel that oversees a nationally coordinated training system, which will be good because it's very sort of uneven at the moment how that's done and how training's funded. So that will be an improvement. What else? Have I missing anything? Tax, second register. I think that's pretty much it, and we're working with the government on draft legislation at the moment, and it will go through Parliament in July this year. So it's ready. There's a rewrite of the Navigation Act as well at the moment. It'll all be coordinated with that. So pretty significant things, and we're very optimistic it'll make a real difference. We've had a lot of companies talking to us. We've got a lot of work going on at the moment, advising various ship owners and overseas ship owners as well in terms of the possibilities. We'll never be a major ship-owning nation, but I think we'll be an important ship-owning nation. We're certainly a very important trading nation, and I think to have greater Australian participation in that is only a good thing. But as I said before, we don't want handouts, we just want to compete on an even playing field, and I think we're going to be able to do that.
Okay, we'll go at the back when the microphone's been passed around.
That's Sam Bateman from the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security. I was going to ask a question of Noel Hart, but I'll take the heat off him and ask a question of the Deputy Hydrographer instead. The downside of ECDIS, of course, is that it's another diversion that stops the seafarer, the watchkeeper, from looking out front, you know, the need to take visual fixes, etc. And of course, that failure to look out the front has been a major factor in the groundings that you talk about. I recently travelled on a large container ship from Hong Kong to France, and I was impressed there that whilst I saw many worrying practices on board, one of the good things was that that company required the watchkeeper to keep a paper chart going as well as ECDIS. I was wondering that with the mandatory introduction of ECDIS, is there also going to be a mandatory requirement to keep the paper chart going? Thank you.
My understanding, and thank you for your question, is that ECDIS will replace the paper chart. So there won't be that requirement to carry a paper chart. With regards to keeping a good lookout, the time some officers spend putting a fix on a chart may also contribute to not looking out front. The ECDIS is providing that real-time eye. They're able to see where they are in relation to the hazards. The paper chart, of course, is only showing where they have been, if they have plotted it correctly. The introduction of ECDIS is to try and reduce the risk to the mariner of introducing errors. And so it will replace the paper chart.
If we can go down the front and then we'll do the back.
Captain Mike Barrett, the Nautical Institute. I'm following up the theme of the last question, but I'd be interested in the opinions of all the panel members on the readiness of Australian shipping, wider regional shipping and visiting shipping for the introduction of mandatory fitting of ECDIS, particularly in terms of training, and perhaps specifically for Captain Daetz. Are you comfortable that mariners are aware of the perhaps most important safety feature within ECDIS, the Australian Navy pioneered zones of confidence, which are so pertinent in your waters?
Thanks, sir. With regards to introducing such a system as ECDIS, it is taking a bit of cultural tweaking for quite a few people to get on top of it, and with that goes the training. There have been incidents already where a ship was fully trained, the crew were fully trained in the operation of the ECDIS, but unfortunately the team was taken off and a new team put on and sailed, which resulted in a grounding. So it really comes down to what training is delivered. The training that needs to be delivered not only is on the actual operation, but the actual system that they're using. And I don't know all the training because I haven't completed it myself, but there are regulatory requirements or obligations within that training that need to be completed for it to be accepted as a standard, or it's standards and specifications for that training for it to be accepted as being registered training.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that there's no doubt that ECDIS is the future, and most seafarers, I think, embrace it and enjoy using it. The old paper charts are, however, it's quite an emotional thing. I know in a company I work for in London, when we took paper charts out, it was a very emotional thing for a lot of the old salts, if you like, to see the paper charts go. And this was just in our emergency control room. We went electronic in there, let alone on the ships. And it was quite a debate about just putting those pieces of paper into well, we put them in a file for the immediate future, so it wasn't quite as heartbreaking. But so there's a bit of a tie to the old paper charts, there's no doubt about it, but I think most seafarers these days are looking forward to widespread use of ECDIS. I think its benefits are significantly better than the old process of going back and plotting on a paper chart. It's a bit like, I guess, going from sextants to sat-nav and that sort of stuff. It's that sort of quantum leap.
Good morning. Good morning, Commodore Dave Gwyther, now with INPEX, the Japanese oil and gas company. I was very interested in Noel's comments about spot cargoes heading to Europe through the piracy areas in the Indian Ocean. Small recollection, I'm not too sad to see the paper chart goes because it also means that the parallel ruler goes, and as a junior officer watch, I used to fear that thing. But anyway, I'd like to direct my question both to Noel, and I know, Andrew, you have some interest in this as well. I'd like to know your current view of the security of our sea lanes of trade to our north and your view on the prognosis with respect to that security for those sea lanes for the future with regard to piracy. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I'm going deaf, so I didn't really hear the question. Look at the security of the sea lanes up to our north. As you go through Southeast Asia, everybody worries about the Malacca Strait. What's going on in the Malacca Strait is not piracy, it's sea robbery. I remember the outcry in Southeast Asia, certainly when the US Navy indicated it might start doing patrols, about 2004, and that was quickly shut down because they actually had no legal jurisdiction. Certainly Sam Bateman has actually just published, or in email correspondence, actually looking at the piracy data from last year actually within Southeast Asia. And the concern in the Malacca Strait has always been, it is not international shipping that's been attacked. It's cross-strait traffic, and certainly last year a lot of the instances actually were barges, tugs, that sort of thing. So this is, in a sense, real crime is actually not affecting trade that much. As you go up further north, certainly, quite often, there's actually not a threat, and this is where I might differ to a lot of people who are in naval uniform, which is, as a civilian, I just regard the situation up there as the shipping industry is vulnerable. There are a variety of things that might happen to it, and what's the possibility that might happen. Certainly the South Koreans have a very, very strong focus on looking at slock protection, because they are very concerned what might happen up there, because again, virtually because of North Korea, they're virtually an island. They rely solely on seaborne trade, and they think their trade might be interdicted. Whether it will or not, we don't know. North Korea might try it, but I don't know how successful they would be. Japan, of course, is a group of islands. They're very worried about their sea lines communication. But again, at the moment, there is no real threat facing them. It's always just the vulnerability. And the biggest concern when you look at on the academic side of looking at sea lines of communication is, what is the real threat? You look off Somalia, yes, something is happening there. But is it really affecting trade? The ships are still going through, and the point I always make when I'm in Southeast Asia and people talk about the Malacca Strait, I'm aware of no instance where any ship is rerouted away from the Malacca Strait, which means that the shipping industry doesn't see it as a problem. I mean, it's not good for the seafarer or anybody on board the ship if something happens, but if the shipping industry isn't fussed and they still put their ships through, then how much of a threat is there? Now, I don't know how well that's answered your question because I only picked up half of what it was, but this is the biggest problem that navies face when you talk about sea lines of communication. It is a major vulnerability. But what is the threat that actually faces it? And most of the time it's a theoretical threat. And how much money can you then devote practicing to work against a theoretical threat unless it actually becomes practical? I don't know if you want to leap in now or not.
One of the great debates that is starting to occur is whether we can actually protect sea lanes of communication anymore, or whether it, especially in a more regional security issue, the number of ships that need to be protected outweighs the number of military or government type assets that we have to protect them with. And so the move, there's a move underway to trend towards localised protection rather than trying to protect the whole sea lane anymore. It's certainly interesting when you add on top of that the different capacities and capabilities of navies to do that. And I think Andrew has contributed to the other part of the equation, and that is that until the merchant community stand up and say we're no longer prepared to put our ships through there for people and other reasons, then there's not going to be any gravity to move towards protecting a sea lane or otherwise.
Yeah. In my experience, looking to the north in terms of the issue of security, that we've had a few concerns at different stages. I think there were some reports of terrorist or piracy movements in the Sulu Sea a couple of years ago, and certain countries stopped their ships going through there. We worked with the security arm of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who obviously have access to intelligence through Navy and other sources, and they were okay with our business still trading through that area, and we never had any incidents, but we did have our ships on high alert and to report anything back to us that they saw that they were uncomfortable with. Never did. There are some, I think, areas where a lot of trade to Japan in particular goes close to two islands and things, through Lombok Straits would be an example. So you may have concerns about whether that was a positioning point for a terrorist type activity. I think more that than piracy there. So it's just a question of the shipping community staying in touch with their governments, intelligence agencies and trade agencies and security arms and military forces, and doing that in a coordinated manner to understand the risks as perceived by people who have the information and to act appropriately.
I think one of the problems we face is, if you look at piracy, so much of the stuff that's written on piracy is actually rubbish. What you see in the media, half the time it's not piracy, it might be sea robbery or something else. The standard source used by media, by a lot of so-called analysts, is the annual IMB report, International Maritime Bureaus. Yeah, IMB, International Maritime Bureau. who punched out a regular piracy report. The problem with that report is it combines together real attacks and attempts. If it makes a mistake, it does not go back and correct it. And virtually every analyst turns to the big table that sits at the very front of the report that lists for the past 10 years every attack there has been. They actually never read the rest of the report that actually says incident by incident which has happened. And when you actually start looking at that, that's when you actually find out, for the Malacca Strait, it is not international shipping that's been attacked. And if international shipping has not been attacked, well, I'm sorry to be blunt, who cares? Because all we're worried about is international shipping. If it's cross-strait traffic, it's the responsibility of the countries sort of involved going down the strait. And that's the biggest problem we face. It's the problem navies face at some stage, which is there's all these erroneous reports out there. It's a huge issue. Actually, it's not. And again, that's not to say it's not affecting a seafarer who might be on board a ship that is attacked, but the whole case is actually overstated. I mean, I remember swearing blind to a number of people that we would never be involved in counter-piracy. And of course, a month later, at that time, we were actually doing it. But again, governments quite often are making decisions in relation to what they see in the media and what might be a public clamour, and quite often is actually wrong and it actually doesn't become good policy. Yeah. Question up the back here.
Thanks. Aidan Morrison. I'm from a small defence startup company. I wanted to ask about that point that David made about whether we actually can protect SLOCs at all. Because it seems to me, given the threat is constituted by a sort of, little dinghy essentially with a few AKs worth about $1,000, and the merchant ships involved are sort of worth, with their cargo, tens to hundreds of millions, and the Navy ships we send with phased array radars and sea-skimming missiles are sort of worth $1 billion, that we're never actually going to be able to meet the protection requirements of all those ships. Can anyone point out on the panel why we haven't started moving towards maybe a force structure change in some ways? That means we've got some slightly lighter assets that are better suited but can still reach the areas that we can send a few more of, for example, than we can afford to send of our major surface combatants.
I don't think I really want to go into force structure determination, but from my perspective it really comes down to numbers and the change in threat over the last 50 years, I guess. It's a view that I think is being more widely shared. It started with a conference of chiefs of Navy in the US, I think about 6 years ago, where the US came up with their 1,000-ship Navy construct, but it wasn't 1,000 US ships, it was 1,000 ships of friends and others that included industry, where they basically said the proportion of the area that was now being used for trade, the number of ships continually increasing, and technology in both of weapon systems and navigation, a whole bunch of things, it was basically physically impossible for, let me get this right, all of the ships of the world's navies over 2,000 tonnes combined to protect worldwide international maritime trade. I think it basically just comes down to us working together and better and smarter, rather than trying to increase numbers in force structure terms, especially where we're in now financially challenged environments, and that's likely to get worse in the future.
Thank you, Andrew. Sam Bateman again. I might now ask that question of Noel Hart, if I may. The international shipowner community continues to be saddled with a minority of disreputable ship owners who continue to operate unsafe ships, excessively exploit seafarers, including, for example, being very slow in paying the ransoms if their ship happens to be hijacked. Now, these unsafe ships continue to show up disproportionately in the ships being hijacked off Somalia, and also in incidents of collisions. I've looked at, for example, at recent collisions in the Malacca and Singapore Straits, and there always seems to be, with those incidents, at least one ship that you would probably judge to be substandard involved. What can the international ship owning community do to get rid of these unsafe ship owner operators? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. A lot of my lifetime's work has been around doing just that, eradicating substandard shipping. Probably I mean, there are a whole host of measures in place in the shipping industry which are designed to ensure that when a ship goes to sea that it's safe and fit for purpose. I'm talking about the registration requirements from the host country, the classification societies who class the ship, the requirements now with the International Ship Management Code and things like ISM codes for standards of ship management, insurance companies that insure the hulls and the cargoes, and you have port state control, of course, AMSA here in Australia, who would go and randomly inspect ships that come to our ports to ensure that they are operating to appropriate standards. So that whole sort of system is meant to work, but obviously it hasn't, and people have been able to duck and weave through all of that. So then you had things like the oil companies introduced vetting systems. I was actively involved in a lot of that in BP, so that none of our traders could charter a ship unless it had been approved by our vetting system. And these have become quite significant and sophisticated online systems now. A lot of the ships are inspected by the oil companies and the gas and the same energy majors and so on now before they're used, and information's kept up to date, and ships are either acceptable or not acceptable in these databases. So there's those sorts of things. In the bulk ore trade, a similar thing has happened. There's an Australian company owned by BHP, Rio Tinto and Cargills, I think it is, called RightShip. So when you had all these bulk carriers that were sailing off over the horizon from northwest Australian ports and disappearing, something was obviously wrong, and that emerged in RightShip coming out as being a vetting system, if you like, that has many mining companies, iron ore, coal importers, and they're doing oil and gas and other things as well now. So you're having these vetting systems set up so that people, before they charter a ship, have some surety that the ship is acceptable. What else has happened? Things like the International Association of Classification Societies got together, and so now a ship owner can't, this happened after the Erika and the Prestige and some of those incidents in Europe, so the ship owner can't duck and weave and change class every second day and be reissued with class. They have to stay with the class society for some time, and there's a long lag time for getting and changing class. So all these things are designed to help. There'll always be people who try to subvert the system. Unfortunately, it's always the minority that give the majority the bad name. You know, any time there's a shipping incident now, the first question that's asked, was the captain drunk? Which is a sad indictment of a wonderful industry. So I think there's a lot being done. There's always still more to do. And I think in terms of the industry associations themselves, in a lot of cases, to be a member of some of these associations, you have to be accepted into it based on standards. The standards may not necessarily be clearly defined in all cases, but in theory there are a lot of rogue ship owners, if you like, that probably wouldn't become members of some of these industry associations, because the industry associations are always pushing for standards and quality and so on themselves. So I think a lot's been done over the last, say, 25 years to improve things, but it's never perfect. So you need all of these other enforcement type things like port state control and vetting systems to ensure that what you think is out there really is, and that it's fit for purpose and safe for you to carry your goods and so on, and for it to be safe to go to sea with the crews on board.
I think I might bring this session to a close now. I mean, first of all, an administrative matter. When you all come back, can you come back and be seated by 11 o'clock, please, so you can get the next session off to a good start. I've certainly enjoyed the session. I think it went well. And if you could join me in thanking the speakers in the usual manner.